All right, so welcome everyone. It is both a pleasure and an honor to introduce a very dear and close friend of mine, Professor Eddie S. Glaude, Jr., the William S. Todd Professor of Religion at Princeton. We are here for round two. Looking out, many of you were here on the first day. Eddie told us a beautiful story that both mapped his personal intellectual journey and I think inspired each of us to think critically about how we might reconstruct ourselves and how each of us can have a prophetic voice. So yesterday's topic was Martin Luther King Jr., who once remarked that everybody can be great because everybody can serve. Well, Eddie did something very similar yesterday and essentially said everybody can be prophetic. Today he's going to talk about the heroic, and I very much look forward to hearing these remarks. Eddie Glaude has often been referred to as one of the towering intellectuals of his generation. And Eddie, I hate to say this, but I take issue with that description. Eddie is one of the towering intellectuals in this country, period.
Oh, thank you.
And this of his generation tag is no longer appropriate. As you will see, for those of you who are here for the first time, he has a sharp, crisp, analytical mind. He is an agile and creative thinker, and he is an entertaining speaker. I'll end as I started by saying that Eddie is a friend. We've known each other since we were teenagers at Morehouse College. And for those of you who are interested, after this is over, I'll be in the back right and we'll tell all the stories about Professor Glaude from our college days. And for a small fee, I will tell the good stories.
Such a lawyer.
Yeah. It is particularly rewarding to see a friend giving such a distinguished lecture and to see a friend having excelled in this particular market, which is not easy. It is an honor to present to you Professor Eddie S. Glaude.
Wow. For every story Professor Sullivan tells, I have another. For him, I want to thank my dear friend for his friendship, for that generous introduction. We've fought many battles, and we've had many arguments over the course of our friendship, arguments about the future of Black America, arguments about the quality of beverage, arguments about a range of things. And so it's important to tell people that you love them in public. And I love you, Sully. I want to thank the committee again for giving me this opportunity to think out loud with you. I don't typically do this, so I've been really pushing myself in this venue. So it's been really fun to do that. I want to thank Professor Gates for making this possible and for his example. I've been watching him closely since I was a baby. It's been rewarding on so many different levels. And thank you to all of my friends who have decided to come hear me talk again. So here we go, on Heroism and Malcolm X. It's a different kind of paper than from yesterday. A beginning. What are you, a fag or something? My father asked. He said it with the look that always frightened me. His arms with open hands would hang at his side. The weight would shift to his right foot. His head would tilt slightly and he would stare. I would freeze. My uncle leaned forward on the couch with a wry smile as he awaited my answer. Something cruel was transpiring, a ritual that I suspect both of them lived through as a child and now relished repeating from the other side. I was playing with Angel, I said. trying to hold back the tears, for if I started to cry like I did most times, whatever it happened to be at the moment, would only get worse. My older brother would tell me to stop crying, that I shouldn't look him in the eye when he yells. I never learned. I always looked him in his eyes. I always cried. Angel was a beautiful and precocious fifth grader in our neighborhood. I laid an elaborate plan to garner her attention through an intense game of hopscotch. She drew the hopscotch pattern on the street, 8 sections with exquisitely drawn numbers. She tossed her rock, lifted her left leg, hopped over square 1, and then continued flawlessly to square 8, only stepping down with both legs on 3 and 4, turned around, hopped back to square 2, picked up her stone, hopped in square 1, and then out. She threw her hand on her hip, flashed her rock, and a smile. My intention was to fail miserably at this. I would step on every line, lose my balance repeatedly, and ask her to show me how to do it again and again. And then came the scream. "Get your ass down here," my dad yelled from the yard. Startled, I ran home, and there I was in the foyer of his house, humiliated with the question about my manhood. I invoke an autobiographical moment not to join the rather tiresome chorus of voices about failed dads. I've come to know, however difficult the journey, that my father loved me in the only way he knew how. My purpose instead is much like that of James Baldwin. Baldwin insisted on retelling the story of his primordial wound, a father who failed to love him because the world, a world organized without him in mind, defeated him daily. That defeat and the rage which inevitably followed spilled over, drowning some but touching all within its reach, quote, between his merciless children who terrified him. The pregnancies, the births, the rats, the murders on Lenox Avenue, the whores who lived downstairs, his job on Long Island to which he went every morning wearing a derby or Homburg and a black suit, white shirt, dark tie, looking like the preacher he was, and his lunchbox in his hand, and his unreciprocated love for the great God Almighty, it is no wonder our father went mad, end quote. To my mind, Baldwin continuously revisited the story of his father with varying detail because it was his way of possessing the wound for himself. Indeed, the daunting task of self-creation for him and for me required and requires a never-ending struggle with such wounds, with the past, in order that we may be released, in order that I may be released into new possibilities. In my case, the effort at self-creation has involved navigating the overwhelming and sometimes overbearing presence of my father and negotiating a nostalgic longing for a political moment that by the accident of birth I could and can never possess. It is an anxiety of influence of sorts, of being born too late, of living in the shadows of what has already been done and said, all of the cultural markers of significance of my young adult life, the events and images that captured my imagination, pointed to the black freedom struggles of the 1960s and 70s, the elegance of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the rage of Malcolm X, the courage of Ella Baker represented a moment that required heroes, but what was left in my hands? How might I imagine myself in light of the greatest generation America has ever produced? Contra Tom Brokaw. It is precisely in this convergence of a need for my father's love and my desire to be a black revolutionary that the task of self-fashioning was lost, if only for a moment, in the fog of an imagination under siege. My primal scene of instruction consists then in a wound inflicted by a loved one, a father who fails to love appropriately, and in an often paralyzing sense of belatedness that makes me at times a sycophant to the supposed grandness of our past. This scene, in all of its messiness, combined with the lived experiences of being African American, casts in relief what Stanley Cavell calls Emersonian perfectionism. The daunting challenge of seeking a higher self in a world that denies one's standing is bad enough. But to seek that self in the shadows of those who heroically resisted those practices to make you possible, and to do so amid the wounds of a personal life lived, gives new meaning to Du Bois's cry of two unreconciled strivings that threaten to unhinge. In this lecture, I want to step into the space I cleared last time we met There I insisted on the power of a certain conception of individuality, one not so much captured by the market and political rationality of neoliberalism or beholden to bourgeois notions of the sovereign subject. Instead, I gestured, admittedly in a romantic register, at an idea of black individuality open to the prophetic function that is, potentially at least, the possession of us all. I ended with an Emersonian flourish that we must not be like sacks and stomachs, repositories for the grand thinking and doing of others, but rather we must be self-reliant change agents in the most robust sense of the phrase for our own times. The reference to Emerson comes from his introduction to Representative Men, and it sets the frame for my lecture this afternoon. I want to think about the currency of the heroic for our own moment. How might its invocation in the right register aid the emergence of a robust form of black individuality that is at once appropriately pious toward tradition and irreverently key to an open-ended future? But this question requires, in my case at least, a prior step. That I interrogate how a particular idea of the heroic blocks my own self-imagining, how the very idea of Malcolm X, a surrogate father found in the Autobiography, threatened to swallow me whole. The argument develops over the course of 3 sections. Hopefully I'll get it in this time. First, I take up the effects of a Carlylean understanding of the hero through an engagement with Barry Schwartz's provocative description of our current moment as a post-heroic age. I then turn to a reading of Emerson's Representative Men, shadowed by its African-American revision as a corrective to that view and as a frame for my own engagement with Malcolm X. And the last section takes up the autobiography and the late Manning Marble's recent biography of Malcolm. My aim is to offer a reading of both that disrupts the delight that has degenerated into idolatry, and to offer his biography as a spur to surpass his witness, as a stairway to a higher form of excellence. The aim is to take my democratized view of the prophetic and yoke it to an idea of the heroic that is within each of us, within the reach of each of us. Now, as a young boy, growing up on the coast of Mississippi, my heroes helped me imagine a world beyond my immediate circumstances. I could not see myself trudging to the shipyard or to the paper mill like most of the adults in my little southern town, or delivering mail as my father did for close to 30 years. And I was a bit too delicate to consider the armed services. At least that's what my father suggested. You can imagine his language is a bit saucier. Instead, my imagination opened up possibilities that everything in my actual life suggested were not within my reach. My heroes typically leapt from the pages of the books I was reading. Wizards and warriors stood alongside Thor and Spider-Man. They displayed remarkable courage and wisdom. All had moral clarity, for their worlds were the stuff of melodrama. Evil was readily seen, and good always in the end won the day. Against the expansiveness of such a world and the characters that inhabited it, Moss Point and its sleepy-eyed residents grew smaller, and I longed for someone bigger. It is here that my commonsensical idea of the hero was born, that person who in appearance seemed like the rest of us, carried within himself something that stretched beyond our ordinary capacity. He was gifted to stand out and to stand above, and our orientation towards him was that of gratitude and longing. The hero had come to represent an archetype of the human endeavor, which exemplified an exacting mode of living, evidenced in the very way he lived a life in the face of ongoing peril. That life speaks to us, drawing us out of the narrowness of our immediate concern into an orbit of questing and challenge that cuts across time and makes possible a higher way of being and conducting oneself. Now, obviously, I have in mind Carlyle's account of the heroic figure mashed together with my pre-adolescent sublime. Carlyle understands the hero in masculinist terms. The hero is that man who exemplifies in his doing an intensity of sincerity that compels him to grapple with the seriousness of things and compels us to hero worship. Quote, he looks through the show of things into things, end quote. All heroes across time exhibit this trait in their characters. They devote themselves to a relentless pursuit of truth and share this in light of the immensity of who they are with the rest of the world. As Carlyle writes, all sorts of heroes, quote, are intrinsically of the same material. that given a great soul, open to the divine significance of life, then there is a man fit to speak of this, to sing of this, to fight and work for this in great, victorious, enduring manner. There is given a hero, the outward shape of whom will depend on the time and the environment he finds himself in, end quote. Heroic personalities are reflections then of the moment that occasioned their emergence. They possess sincerity, which has, quote, in very truth, something divine, end quote, right? And when thought of collectively, given the trials of an age, that generation, a heroic generation, provides the frames of reference for moral and practical judgment for succeeding generations. As I grew older, I left behind the heroes of my fantasies. Martin and Malcolm, Stokely and Huey stood in their stead. All served, I suppose, as proxies for an ideal of masculinity compromised by the lingering wounds of a father's love. Theirs was indeed a heroic age, a time when individuals in community emerged from the shadows of American apartheid to challenge long-standing social customs, to upend racist laws, and to face down the brutal violence that sustained both. It was a period in which young people of all colors asserted themselves throughout the country, shattering received understandings of masters and their so-called subordinates, and leaving the shards beneath the country's feet. For some, the upheaval, chaos of the 1960s marked the end of heroism. Barry Schwartz argues, for example, in Abraham Lincoln in the post-heroic era, that, quote, as the lives of the great were cynically scrutinized for cruelty, treachery, prejudice, and egoism, the growth of racial, religious, and ethnic justice, real equality of opportunity, compassion, and the recognition of minority achievement and dignity expands, end quote. But this expansion carried with it the diminishing value of heroic narratives. Quote, excessive focus on pathology and moral shortcomings, end quote, Schwartz argues, made us all susceptible to the slave morality that so worried Friedrich Nietzsche. Goods more consonant with multicultural ideals replaced strength and virility, and we became to shamelessly steal from Baldwin, like our bread, tasteless foam rubber. Such leveling banished any substantive ideal of greatness. We were left, Schwartz maintains, with, quote, no feeling of having descended from a higher state of political morality, no nostalgic longing for a sublime period in which great men walked the earth, no belief in, let alone effort to restore earlier periods of epic heroism, end quote. But this view seems entirely foreign to me, because the men and women of the 1960s and 70s are the giants stalking around my political imagination. Fannie Lou Hamer's testimony before the Credentials Committee at the 1964 Democratic National Convention powerfully represented the conditions of millions. It was nothing short of heroic. If the Freedom Democratic Party is not seated now, she famously said, I question America. Is this America the land of the free and the home of the brave, where we have to sleep with our telephones off the hooks because our lives be threatened daily because we want to live as decent human beings in America, end quote. Her willingness to risk her life to challenge Jim Crow joined with countless others who sacrificed to make real the promises of American democracy. And given the fact that this work emanated from my home state of Mississippi, her actions, Bob Moses' actions, Hollis Watkins' actions, we go on, their actions made me possible. So to my mind, this doesn't constitute the end of heroism, nor does it locate heroic action in some narrow group identity politics. Theirs was an epic struggle in which extraordinary effort on behalf of generations to come transformed the very nature of American society and provided the frame for future self-understanding. Generations to follow claimed them as heroic defenders of a higher state of morality, yearned for the moment in which each walked the earth, and constantly refer back to their efforts as we seek to approximate their heroic example. Our task has been, consciously or not, to preserve and consolidate their victories. Emerson comes to mind here. Our age is retrospective, he wrote in Nature. It builds the sepulchres of the fathers. It writes biographies, histories, and criticism. The foregoing generations beheld God and nature face to face, we through their eyes, end quote. For Schwartz, following George Forgy, preservation and consolidation are the tall tale signs of a post-heroic moment. Forgy, for example, describes the anxieties and ambivalences suffered by a generation born after the American Revolution, Unable to fight in the war, but still close enough to the event to hear stories and to experience it as living memory, antebellum Americans, according to him, sublimated their sense of belatedness by preserving and remembering the heroic deeds of the Revolutionary era, an era that placed a certain form of heroism beyond the reach of those who were its immediate beneficiaries. One can readily see the parallels, right? A generation of African Americans born too late to participate in the black freedom struggles of the 1960s and 70s, but still close enough to the moment for it to cast an enormous shadow over our doings and sufferings. We find ourselves constantly navigating its demands and purchase on us. Ours, it would seem, is a post-heroic generation, but I'm not so convinced. Such moments simply mark the conditions for the possibility of the emergence of new forms of greatness. Fraught though the times may be by a profound and sometimes paralyzing anxiety, different and conceivably more powerful selves may emerge on the horizon. But what gets in the way is the very idea of the hero, of the past within which he acted, and our orientation to both. You can see I was cutting stuff, right? All too often, invocations of the black freedom struggle and its heroes in the context of political argument require appropriate deference, or one's actions risk the label of racial impiety. This illustrates more than anything how the work of preserving and consolidating that Schwartz alludes to often reflects a more complex devolution of the moral claims of any struggle to a kind of moralism that inverts that struggle's more radical thrust. The codification of moral claims and methods, along with increasing legitimization, transform, potentially at least, passion and vision into rancor and conservation. We may find ourselves invoking rote phrases and empty slogans, as well as engaging in unimaginative marches, a movement from King to Sharpton, from Malcolm to Farrakhan. The stories of the movement may become justification for a disciplinary practice, as when black voters are told to get in line in support of President Obama, because that support exemplifies an act of piety. Perhaps we find that the very idea of blackness goes imperial, absorbing all facets of our complex lives. Or we may hear the invocation of one of the movement's heroes as a basis for the condemnation of current practice, Representative Allen West stating that Dr. King would condemn the Occupy Wall Street movement, right? The authority of black moralism rests in the temporal trace of a heroic age. Those who embrace it invoke the movement's martyrs and their achievements, along with its vocabularies, as a way to claim their legitimacy in the face of the eroding conditions of much of contemporary black life. Dogmatic embrace and self-righteous certainty replace experimentation and open-ended inquiry. As such, the moralism of these confident men and women actually reflects the evisceration of the sustaining moral vision of the black freedom struggle. One of the consequences of this evisceration is, quote, a kind of moralizing against history in the form of condemning particular events or utterances, read Black Power, and personifying history and individuals, read Dr. King, end quote. More explicitly, moralism in black politics invokes history as a way of arresting it. I like that sentence. Moralism in black politics invokes history as a way of arresting it. Invocations of the movement work to freeze us in the options it makes available, often drowning those of us who take it seriously in a nostalgic longing for origins, and to enslave us to the people and their surrogates we are expected to follow. To be sure, black moralists often deploy heroes to shut down any possibility of speaking back to tradition and of engaging in imaginative inquiry by narrowing the range of words and deeds available to us. Now, the worry here is not so much the eclipse of a heroic time, that the hero is no longer possible. Rather, the problem resides in the socio-political and cultural context that actively works to block the way for expressions of the heroic under present conditions, conditions that, to paraphrase Nietzsche, transform, quote, our instinct for freedom into something that vents itself only on itself, end quote. The challenge facing individuals and generations born in the shadows of a great time involves, among other things, finding that right relation, and now here I'm talking to myself, but that right relation between piety, wound, and self-creation. Unlike Schwartz, mine is not a concern about the consequences of leveling. He's right to hold the view that the value that affirms the dignity and standing of all people eclipses the value placed in so-called superior men standing over and above inferior men and women. But for Schwartz, this becomes an ironic feature of what he calls a post-heroic age, that its signal achievement, the recognition of every citizen's worthiness and his inclusion into the social mainstream, actually marks the death of the hero. But on my view, the black freedom struggle of the 1960s and 70s is an exemplification of the heroic aligned with American democratic life. And the problematic is, how do descending generations step from under its moralizing shadow? How do they find their own voice and stand in unique relation to the archive that calls them to a higher self and to a more exacting mode of living? Schwartz need only think more carefully about the relation of the hero to democracy. He need only read his Emerson more closely to see how representativeness reflects a democratic sensibility. Now, Emerson, this is the second section, or third section, Emerson, the hero and representativeness. Y'all all right? I'm happy I got to a point where I want to be. Emerson held a view of the hero, a different view of the hero than Carlyle. His wasn't the warrior or strong man who redirects the course of history, but the self-reliant individual mindful of the pitfalls of conformity. In fact, in Representative Men, Emerson turned to the lives of great men as resources for the art of living, not as towering heroic figures to be worshiped or idolized. He went as far as to declare, quote, "There are no common men. All men are at last of a size, and true art is only possible on the conviction that every talent has its apotheosis somewhere," end quote. Of course, this does not deny the obvious fact of the unequal distribution of talent. All of us do not exhibit the skill and imagination of a Michael Jordan or Ella Baker. But Emerson sets out to square that fact with the democratic value of the equality of persons. The task in Representative Men was not to make us feel somehow less than in the face of the likes of Plato, Shakespeare, and Goethe, that following Carlyle, common folk should pine to be governed by the likes of strong and resolute men. Rather, Emerson sought to democratize greatness, to invoke the example of heroes who exemplify what we are in fact capable of. Our encounter with great people, then, serves to educate ourselves in greatness such that we might exemplify that quality in our own unique way, in our own lives. Hero worship blocks the way to such a realization. Emerson understood the seduction of the hero, his allure and dangers. He not only explored the distinctive qualities of his exemplars, he also confronted fully their shortcomings. Plato left us with no system. Shakespeare lacked an interest in originality, and Goethe was, quote, entirely at home and happy in his century and the world. These great persons, he went on to say, are but in exhibition in some quarter of new possibilities. In other words, great people exist that there may be even greater men and women to follow. Representativeness becomes the operative word here, not Carlyle's hero. The hero stands in an uneasy relation to democratic life. The gravitational pull of his personality causes us to bulge out in the direction of him, losing sight of our capacities as the certainty of the hero's position becomes our own. In light of this, Sidney Hook argued in The Hero in History that democracies should be deeply suspicious of heroes because the very temperament that sets them apart threatens, in the end, the fabric of democratic life. Not that heroes always stand on the verge of becoming tyrants, individuals willing to rush past the consent of others to the conclusion evident to their own sense of things. Instead, the sincerity of the hero's vision and his willingness to stand in our stead actually encourage the abdication of the responsibilities democracies demand. We become all too willing to give ourselves over to the hero in our midst. Crises often require heroes, but their actions aren't necessarily mindful of the constraints of democratic life. So democracies must transform the heroic and recast its function in light of a view of democratic virtue. As Hook notes, echoing Emerson, quote, "A democracy should encourage the belief that all are called and all may be chosen," end quote. You hear the continuities with yesterday, right? That all have the potential to attain heroic stature, and that the regulative ideal that ought to animate our form of life should be, quote, "every person a hero," end quote. This is indeed leveling, but it's leveling up, as Robert Richardson describes Emerson's work. Now, of course, this reconstructed idea of the hero becomes all the more difficult to substantiate when hero worship dwarfs our self-conception and we fail to see ourselves as representative figures for our age. Instead, we reach for the hem of the garment of our heroes, desperately trying to approximate their magical powers in our own time. This, however, isn't the malaise of a post-heroic moment. It is, at least to me, the burden of history. Across the proverbial railroad tracks, the temporal trace of Emerson's idea of representativeness can be found in the familiar trope of the race man, or in Ralph Waldo Ellison's incantation of the Renaissance man. Both are ideal types that function within a racialized landscape where the life chances of African Americans are decidedly circumscribed. Both reflect, as Hazel Carby has demonstrated, an ideology of masculinity that overdetermines how we conceive of black leadership, how we engage in black politics, and how we take up the task of self-creation. But each inflects the idea of representativeness in different ways. In Black Metropolis, for example, Caton and Drake described race men as those men who with sincerity sought the advancement of the race. These men invoked racial solidarity and cultivated racial pride, which carried with them ideas of ethical obligation to other African Americans and a duty to represent the race in deed and action. For some reason, when I read represent, I kept thinking of Nas's Illmatic. Anyway, you'll get it when you go listen to the album. Such men, no matter their station, could become heroes. Caton and Drake maintained if they dared to challenge and, quote, beat the white man at his own game or force the white man to recognize his talents or service or achievement, right? These men could be race men. These men could also easily become race hustlers, those who exploited appeals to racial pride for their own selfish gain. Now, just as an aside, Hazel Carby makes much of this moment in Black Metropolis, but she failed to give some attention to a footnote that actually suggests that Caton and Drake were a little bit more sensitive to gender than she actually suggests. All right, check that footnote out. Ellison's Renaissance men are of a different sort. To be sure, the limit conditions of black life are readily apparent in his account, but these conditions do not define black people in toto. Instead, the frontier of Oklahoma, Ellison would have us believe, afforded him and his childhood friends an opportunity to create themselves anew, to reach beyond the narrow confines of Jim Crow and to imagine a more expansive self. The Renaissance man invoked a sense of being at home in a world that presupposed one's displacement. It was a heroic assertion of self-possession among a cadre of fatherless boys who decided, despite their circumstances, quote, to be whoever we would and could be and do anything and everything which other boys did and do it better, end quote. The Renaissance man reconstructs Emerson's notion of representativeness by exposing the illusion of an uncontaminated innocence, a young Emerson's words, not my own, that attempts to cut short the life possibilities of America's darker souls. The idea stands as a powerful counterweight, a symbol of possibility, heroic possibility, rooted in the very dynamic of African American culture. The difference between race and Renaissance men can now be readily seen. The disposition of the former directs us to the political realities of a racist state, the latter to the daunting task of the art of living under captive conditions. For Ellison and for someone like Albert Murray, the challenge entails resisting the temptation to reduce African American life to the evil of white supremacy or to define our doings and sufferings solely in terms of what Ellison calls sociology or to what Murray referred to as the Marxist Freudian variant of American protest literature. Both insisted, and rightly so, that we are more complex than that, and both rejected giving the realities of American racism center stage in our effort at self-making. But what if the problem is no longer that of protest literature or a politics that deigns to reduce individuals to angry, flat characters who murder white women and later grow afros and give fiery speeches? What if the fire drake, the very condition for the possibility of heroic action, has slipped from view and we're left with black bourgeois aspirational claims standing in for all black politics? What if a form of black moralism blocks the way to how I might answer the questions, who am I, what am I, how did I come to be? What shall I make of the life around me? What does American society mean when regarded out of my own eyes, when informed by my own sense of the past and viewed by my own complex sense of the present? As Ellison asked in the beginning of Shadow and Act, answers to these questions make possible representative figures who take up an original relation to the universe. And if this is to be so, For me, at least, the task, it would seem, involves turning to my first real hero, Malcolm X, the figure who stood in for a father beyond my reach and who set the terms for my political self-understanding, grappling with his life, citing him in that sense Benjamin meant by citation, in my own manic effort to forge a self under present conditions may just be the path to momentary salvation. Last 15 minutes, the humanization of the sublime Malcolm X. Malcolm's life is the stuff of lore. His autobiography stands as a canonical text in American letters, introducing young and old readers to an extraordinary journey of self-creation. The backdrop of this story, of course, is Malcolm's role in the Nation of Islam, an organization quite skeptical, to put the point mildly, of the U.S., as well as his strident criticisms of white supremacy during the brief period after his departure from the NOI. So we encounter in the narrative a figure of heroic stature, a paragon of black masculinity, daring to speak truthfully to white and black folks. In fact, as you all know, Ossie Davis powerfully eulogized Malcolm by declaring Malcolm was, quote, our manhood, our living black manhood. This was his meaning to his people, and in honoring him, we honor the best in ourselves. Now, this view captures beautifully my own embrace of the autobiography. There, I found the language to interpret my father's rage. He couldn't stand white people either. And that anger, I believe, was at the root of his distance from us, from me. Unlike Malcolm, my father did not channel his rage into acting on behalf of the liberation of black people. Instead, he delivered mail, called me a fag, and put a generalized fear in me that I had to work hard to hide. Malcolm became then a surrogate father. His words offered a vivid picture of the kind of self I needed to create in order to become a man who would not be swallowed whole by a broken relationship with his father. I had my first conversion experience during the summer of 1986. I had just finished reading Malcolm's autobiography and had become convinced that a certain form of black nationalism was black America's saving grace, the backstory to the Kente Draws comment. The book affirmed a growing suspicion that I had about American democracy. To put it bluntly, I began to understand America as a nation consumed by white supremacy. I also felt that if black folk were to achieve a modicum of sanity and well-being, they had to reject this country, that our allegiance had to be to ourselves because the necessary condition for the flourishing of American democracy was the subordination of black people. In effect, a choice was made. America was simply not for me, even though I was at Morehouse, and a particular form of black nationalist politics became the way I articulated this rejection. This was indeed a conversion. It was a radical transformation of the heart that expressed itself in the very way I lived my life. I stopped doing what ordinary college students do. I read Harold Cruz and Sheikh Anta Diop, George James, Walter Rodney, and other figures in the black nationalist canon. I reorganized my relationships and socialized only with like-minded persons, and I noticed that they all comported themselves in a certain way, so I did too. They even had a peculiar smell. I remember rubbing my neck with these incense sticks that smelled like nationalists because I didn't know oils were the source of the revolutionaries' odor. I was, after all, from a small town on the coast of Mississippi, where the paper mill and the porgy fish plant provided smells most familiar to me. Black nationalist pieties were about as foreign as Islam. But my conversion to black nationalism marked a beginning, a way of defining myself as a man over and against the overbearing presence of my father's image. What better path to take than a politics which assumes manliness as a prerequisite for entree into the community of saints, a performance of unfettered masculinity where black boys could be men as they challenge white boys in the manly game of politics. My own understanding of black radicalism then was bound up in the languages and images of the black nationalisms of the 60s and 70s, and in order to be militant, to not be my father, I had to be Malcolm. So I bought my horn-rimmed glasses. I grew my goatee, which will always be here. And I lost myself in the imitation of my hero. To be sure, the success of the autobiography stems in part from its digestibility. The narrative reads somewhat like the rags to riches stories of the late 19th century, right? From orphan to international leader, from small-time hustler to one of the most important political voices of the 20th century. Quintessentially, this is an American story. The late Manning Marable, in his Du Bois lectures, makes much of the constructed nature of the autobiography and Alex Haley's role in taming Malcolm, or to put the point more baldly, Haley's role in making Malcolm acceptable to mainstream America. Marable discusses the missing final chapters of the book and Haley's complicity in what can only be seen as a government-derived effort to cast Malcolm in a particular light. For Marable, the reclamation of Malcolm X from the distortion of the autobiography constitutes an important act of pietistic recovery, a historical reclamation of a heroic figure from the domesticating effects of the very vehicle that launched him into a broader political imaginary. The irony here is glaring. Marable's exquisite biography, Malcolm X, A Life of Reinvention, published just a few days after his death, has been derided by many as impious. For example, some question Marable's inclusion of the salacious suggestion that Malcolm engaged in homosexual behavior, and others dislike his account of Malcolm's marriage to Betty Shabazz. Such accounts, they seem to suggest, dull the image of our shining black prince and join with the other details of the book, make Malcolm all too human. But my interest in the autobiography are not rooted in a search for an authentic or truer account of Malcolm. Instead, I'm intrigued by how the autobiography works in shaping our reception of Malcolm X as a heroic figure, how the book cast its spell on me, mindful all the while of what Angela Davis brilliantly describes as the one-dimensional iconization of Malcolm as a commodity of for consumption. In my view, the autobiography works in at least two ways in establishing Malcolm's moral standing. On the one hand, it stands as an example of spiritual autobiography. Malcolm charts his journey from debased criminal on the margins of any moral order to a devout Muslim, and St. Augustine's Confessions come to mind. But then there's another way in which you can think about the book, and that is the history and continued presence of racism in American life connects it to slave narratives and the style of writing indebted to that form that is so familiar to many of us. And Arnold Rampersad talks about this in his essay. Emphasizing this dimension of the book turns our attention away from Malcolm as moral exemplar, and instead we're confronted with a more secular, heroic figure. And here I'm thinking about Rousseau's Confessions as a model, right? So in both instances, right, Malcolm is cast simultaneously as religious exemplar and secular prophet. Right? Both solidify his standing as a heroic figure. So what is striking about the autobiography, read in both registers of the spiritual and secular hero, is that the dynamism of Malcolm's life gets lodged in the moral lesson contained therein. In other words, the autobiography, at least today, works to confirm Malcolm's heroic status. It fixes him in his virtue and predetermines how that virtue speaks to us as readers, at least it tries to. Now, obviously, we come to know Malcolm. I got 5 minutes. Obviously, we come to know Malcolm X as hero through a broader narrative about African-American struggle. He stands alongside others whose sacrifice constitute the conditions for our possibility, and it is in our relation to that past, its purchase on our moral and ethical sensibilities, that we come to understand ourselves as particular kinds of agents. How we remember is fraught with ethical significance, precisely because those memories orient us to the present and often, all too often, set our course for future action. But these memories are not simply backward-looking, right? They also orient us to the future. Acknowledgement of past sacrifices constitute, of course, an act of piety. That is, the recognition of heroic lives as sources for who we take ourselves to be. That recognition, however, like any gesture to the past, can consume us. We can become lost in the immensity of the personality, and our own individual qualities are diminished. Exemplars are curious in this way. They both inspire and potentially enslave. We must work then to strike the right balance between admiration and self-trust, not succumbing to the temptation of idolatry, which blinds us to our own unique excellences and potential greatness. Instead, our orientation to the past and its exemplars like Malcolm must consist in a lively relation, one in which our thinking remains open-ended and imaginative recovery of the past. Its citation potentially disrupts current justifications of the order of things. This, to me, is the astonishing achievement of Marable's biography. What is valued here isn't a kind of certainty about political matters or the power of rhetorical excess evident in Malcolm's invective. Instead, Malcolm's life is transformed from that of instantiated hero to that of a representative figure engaged in the unnerving task of self-creation. Throughout the biography, as Imani Perry notes, we find Malcolm flailing and failing over and over again. He's alone and betrayed, and yet constantly seeking a higher self. The autobiography isn't displaced then by a truer account of Malcolm's life. Rather, it is confronted by the frail humanity of its subject. The former demands imitation, the latter solidarity. The moralism of the former casts us as epigoni, the latter as co-creators, potentially at least, of a better world. Malcolm now stands as wounded as I am. He's recognizable not as a surrogate father, but as an exemplar of an unexamined life lived. To be sure, the wounds themselves no longer need to be hidden. Instead, they must be tended to with care. This orientation undermines the masculinist politics that undergirds the heroic representation of Malcolm. Instead of supplicating to a shining black prince, we confront a wounded, vulnerable black man courageously fighting with others and reaching for higher levels of excellence. Wounded in public with others, dismisses attributions of divine favor and instead locates the representative figure squarely in Beckett's mess. It is the kind of disposition requisite for the politics of tending I believe Ella Baker exemplifies. So how then ought we to understand Malcolm as a representative figure? We must find in his wounded witness those characteristics worthy of our own moment. Not to imitate them, but to enact those traits in our very living because, in fact, they are evident, at least potentially, in our characters. Malcolm was a tinkerer, an experimentalist at his core, tending to the needs of those who he powerfully described as the rejected and the despised. Michael Eric Dyson has it right. I can't believe I'm quoting Michael. Michael Eric Dyson has it right when he says, Malcolm's greatest contribution to us is to think for ourselves, to learn to help ourselves when others refuse, and to demand a world in which such help is not the preserve of the privilege, but the domain of everyday ordinary folks, end quote. To think of Malcolm otherwise is to make of him a sedative. He becomes the basis for us to sleepwalk. Now, the delicate balance, I'm coming to a close, y'all. I've never read anything like this in public in my life. The delicate balance between piety, wound, and self-creation is found in the very effort to forge a unique life in the context of a world seemingly indifferent to our aims and ambitions. Such a life is funded by past experiences that inform our fits and starts, and by the prospects of a future that lies just beyond our fingertips. In his 1990 Nobel lecture, Octavio Paz captured what I'm reaching for here in his reflections on the relation of tradition to modernity. For him, quote, between tradition and modernity, there's a bridge. When they are mutually isolated, tradition stagnates and modernity vaporizes. When in conjunction, modernity breathes life into tradition, while the latter replies with depth and gravity, end quote. He goes on to say that reflecting on the now does not imply relinquishing the future or forgetting the past. The present is the meeting place for the three directions of time. It is here, right here, where the depth of our past informs heroic efforts by the most unlikely of persons to speak prophetically to the challenges of now. And it is with this insight that I set up my turn to the philosophy of Ella Baker. Thank you.
Oh, Eddie, I enjoyed that very much, very much. What do you mean that you never read anything like this in public? You mean autobiographical?
Yeah. You know, most people don't know that I was a youth minister at the top of the clock in Philadelphia.
It's all over your face.
Can you tell? My disposition, as it were. A lot of people, I've never really written about my dad or spoken about my father in public.
I didn't know you were from a paper mill town like me.
Yeah, you know that smell that hits the
I know
town.
that smell.
So in some ways, being from a working class family in Mississippi, it's really dangerous to talk about wounds in public.
No, it's not.
I remember the reaction to your memoir.
Yeah, but it was a bestseller.
I ain't talking about that. I'm talking about my father.
Oh, you're talking about the people at home. My mother and father loved it. Well, my mother was gone. My father,
Yeah.
loved the book. But a handful of people in would I rather have 5 million people read it and 50 people pissed off? I think I'll take.
But in some ways, it's really, Skip, it's really trying to come to terms with, and I'm learning this from my work on Baldwin, trying to come to terms with how this broken relationship, or at least what was once broken, right, has defined how I've lived my life.
Has your
today.
father passed?
No, he's still here.
So he's going to read this.
Absolutely.
It'll be good,
God willing.
That's how progress is made. Ralph Ellison wrote an essay, famous essay called The Little Man at Chee Hall Station.
Right.
And he says, always be careful where you are, get your facts right, because you never know who's going to be in the audience. Well, Malcolm X's nephew is sitting right there. And I want to know if Rodnell would like to comment.
He's like, why did you do that? That's that look on his face.
Well, only Dr. Gates has a right to do that. So anyone else, I would not. But I like what I hear, particularly addressing Marable's book and Malcolm's autobiography. There are some things, perhaps we all publicly have heard. There are some things, but your whole presentation of it, how you handled the autobiography of Malcolm and Manning Marable, how you put it forth to the audience, explaining it, I find it that I think it's at this present time, since Dr. Marable just passed, we do need someone like yourself presenting the view you just put forward. So I appreciate that very much. There are issues.
Absolutely.
With Marable's book, the personal things, wife. There are things that you mentioned that I know of personally myself.
Absolutely.
Having been there. So how it was handled in Marable's book is one thing. But all in all, I must say, I'm proud, and particularly about yourself and what you've gone through with your father, and all of us are fathers, are mothers. And Malcolm's relationship with his father was short, but he had an indirect relationship with his grandfather that died after Malcolm's father was assassinated. And he died of a heart attack. And that heart attack was brought on by the hurt of losing his son to do, he wanted to do what his son had done. And this is a man that was born into slavery. Malcolm never got a chance to meet his grandfather, but my Uncle Wilford did. And so I've had a view of seeing family members, and particularly the men, and their feelings reaching back to what has happened to us here in America, particularly looking at our parents and going back and going back and going back and coming forward. So Malcolm, he carried that load of wanting to be the man that we all need to be, particularly pertaining to the situation that we are here in America. So I see that, and I understand what you were saying, and I can relate to that, thinking back on that. So I must say I'm pleased.
Appreciate it.
Must say I'm
I mean,
pleased.
part of what I'm up to, if you recall the argument, the arc of the argument in the first lecture, right, is to say that a particular conception of the prophetic and a particular conception of the heroic actually distort Black democratic life. My intervention is to render the prophetic not as something that's someone who's authorized from without, but to render it as a part of the moral, as a feature of the moral imagination in the exercise of critical intelligence. How does the hero work? Well, what I wanted to do is to kind of really personalize it, right? To kind of talk about how the hero actually calls forth a posture of supplication as opposed to necessarily a posture of action, right? And I wanted to do that in relation to my own life so that I could show how a particular way of thinking about woundedness can actually disrupt a masculinist politics that often undergirds the very ways in which the hero distorts democratic politics in Black lives. So part of what I wanted to do was to implicate myself in this moment, right? To talk about being wounded with others in public as we work, right, to secure shared aims and ends as a feature of democratic life. But in order to open up the way in which I'm thinking about Ella Baker as an exemplar of what Sheldon Wolin calls a politics of tending, right, I had to make this sort of move. So this is why it's a different kind of form.
You've provided a wonderful lecture for us to reflect, and I guess what I want to push at today is to seize on you keep saying it's a certain form of heroism that is distortive, right, that you want to really get at. So, which then leads me to ask if there is any form of heroism at all that, if you like, a kind of unheroic heroism. And I'm thinking here of, let's say, someone like Mandela, and the condition on which Mandela has been able to sort of remain somewhat heroic was to relinquish power. Was to relinquish power, not to continue in office. He had only one term. Like, if he had continued, it would have been pushed, So, I mean, is there, and again, I'm thinking there's a wonderful quotation at the end of Bertolt Brecht, Galileo. And it's a confrontation between Galileo and his pupil, Andrea. And Andreas, this is after Galileo fails to stand up to the church, and he's condemned. He becomes a prisoner of the Inquisition, and his people says, unhappy is the land without heroes. And Galileo says, no, unhappy is the land that has a need for heroes. So how to negotiate between these two conditions, the constant need for heroism, right, and the great problems that arise with heroism. And especially since you keep saying it's a certain form of heroism that you have a... So can we envision those forms of heroism that are not necessarily distortive? And finally, you did mention very briefly that, I don't know if you meant this, anyway, you did mention about a post-heroic age.
Yeah, this is Barry Schwartz's argument that I think is just wrong.
Okay,
I just think he's wrong. And this is a really good question, right? I mean, because at this, in responding to Schwartz's claim that the 60s actually constitute the end of heroic narratives, I actually call forward, right, the heroic actions of the Black freedom struggle, right? So the fact that John Lewis would risk himself in the way he did, Diane Nash, the fact that the Freedom Riders would do what they did, the fact that SNCC would go into the bowels of the South and do what they did, the fact that people would organize and risk their lives in the way that they did, right? It has this leveling effect, but to have the leveling effect isn't to deny the heroic, right? In fact, what I'm interested in is the way in which that actually exemplifies the capacities of everyday ordinary people. But what happens then is that that story is then rendered in a moralistic kind of way, and I'm using moralism in a very distinctive way. And it's rendered in such a way to discipline populations and preceding and descending generations, right? It becomes a way of constraining how one speaks back to the tradition. It becomes a way to justify and authorize, right, in my view, a particular political class that seeks to exploit, in light of its own interest, in the name of the movement. So what's really disturbing for me is not the question of heroes as such, but really how heroes are deployed within a moralistic narrative that constrain imagination, that actually produce dispositions that lead us to abdicate responsibility, which democracy demands. So part of the way in which I've tried to parse that out, and I didn't do it very well, is the very way in which my own nostalgia for origins, rooted in a primal wound, orients me to Malcolm. So instead of, it was really weird, right? My life, I read Malcolm and I saw him go through the nation. But I buy my horn-rimmed glasses and join the nation. So I started not at the back end, but at the front end, right? And saw some really crazy stuff, right? So this is really a kind of, I said I lost myself, right, in the imitation of my hero. And this is Emerson's point, right? Imitation is suicide, right, in this regard. So if what is required is a robust black individuality to short-circuit the logics of white supremacy, which demand that the complexity of our lives is collapsed into interests that are being represented by a particular class. And how that happens is that there's a deployment of a moralistic narrative that disciplines how we think. Right? Then the hero in that context becomes deeply problematic for democratic purposes. But that's not to say that when, I used this example with someone yesterday, when John Lewis is on the ground, his head has been beaten wide open, or when Bob Moses' head has been busted wide open. And people see it and they go, wow, I don't know if I could do that. He must be a unique person. As opposed to, right, unique person and then you supplicate. Or as opposed to, he found it within himself to risk himself. Maybe I could do it too. It's a whole different orientation. So that's this long-winded way of trying to see how I'm distinguishing them. Because what's at stake here is this, what happens to this robust sense of black individuality as a way of breaking open, right, space for a complex democratic politics within our community. Sister Darlene.
Thank you. Both of your presentations have been so wonderfully provocative. And I'd like to just continue engaging you in this conversation that you've ignited. But I have a very simple question. All of the heroes that you've talked about or discussed have, in some ways, become martyrs. Is there a distinction between hero and the martyr? Yes. And also, is it possible to become a hero in a capitalistic democracy representing the underprivileged when the whole purpose of the democracy is to maintain hierarchy and privilege? So what is the hero supposed to accomplish?
Let's try to tackle the second question first, and then I'll move to the first question. Because the first question is pretty straightforward for me. What is the hero? What might heroic action achieve under neoliberal conditions in which selfishness is virtue? Neoliberalism's presumption is that self-care, right, is sufficient insofar as the state's function is not to attend to the well-being of its citizens, but rather to ensure efficiency and economic in the market's work. Right? And so it's designed to produce particular kinds of selves who are most interested in a certain kind of consumption, right? A certain kind of aggrandizement of self-interest, right? And to the extent to which that is neoliberalism's aim, it eviscerates any conception of public life, right? Because we're all retreating into these spaces, right? So there's a reason why it's self-help. There's a reason why poor people are responsible for their condition, because the state isn't responsible in this regard, right? Self-care. We're supposed to, if you're not doing it, then you're responsible for it not happening. So what constitutes heroic action under those conditions, right? In some ways, it's really to create the context by which everyday ordinary people can disrupt that procedure, neoliberalism's work, and how it conceives of who we take ourselves to be. So that may very well look differently when we're talking about an issue around the school board. How do we mobilize and organize around issues of curricula? And the ways in which we organize around curricula could involve, right, tapping folks who are concerned about the issue and creating the context by which they enunciate a conception of themselves that actually resist, right, the idea of retreating to their own self-interest, right? So, and then creating the context where someone at some point will step out and take the risk. And in taking the risk, we witness beauty and sublime, that which is the sublime. But we understand that at that very moment, there's a danger. And the danger is that the heroic or the hero automatically presents him or herself as the charismatic figure that can actually turn around and capture that explosion of democratic energy. It's a long-winded way of saying, Darlene, that the moment, that the way in which these heroic energies erupt, and I'm sounding too Bolinian, it's episodic. And it's always already in danger of being undermined by charisma, right? And I just think of SNCC as an example, right? And we could talk about that. You can't tell us though. So that's the first. So the answer is what constitutes heroic action will vary in light of the problems faced, but in terms of the process and method, right, it proceeds by way of asserting the conditions for the development of a robust individuality that speaks to, right, those conditions that undermine democratic life. That's the first answer. Second question, there's a distinction between heroes and martyrs. Yes. When I first met Mr. Moses, I think I freaked him out because I started crying. I don't think he remembered this. Him and Hollis Watkins were sitting at the table, and I didn't know how to thank them, right? So, because I'm from Mississippi, right? And, you know, I mean, I'm from Gut Butt, Mississippi. I'm not from Itabena, but I'm from Moss Point, right? I'm not from Indianola. I'm from a place named after moss on magnolia trees, right? And so I was trying to relate to them, listen to them, my gratitude. And the only thing that came was tears. And I remember Hollis Watkins going, like, what's wrong with this Negro? You know, this kind of thing, right? So, but they're alive, right? And so they're heroes in the very way in which I experience the way in which they walk the planet, right? Martyrdom, all martyrs are heroes, but not all heroes are martyrs. Just a simple way of responding. Does that make sense? Yeah. I got to shorten my answers. I'm sorry.
Thanks, Eddie. Just want to. So, I mean, it's clear that you think that it's not heroes as such, right? That's the problem. Uh-huh. So we know that narratives about heroes can also inspire people to action. And right. We know that heroes can also be appropriate models when it comes to you know be like this person, not like that person, and so on. So it has these other kind of positive functions that don't lead to inaction or passivity. Mm-hmm. So I guess I'm sort of wondering why you're confident. Maybe I'm just misunderstanding you. Why you're confident that the hero in narratives of the Black freedom struggle is the right diagnosis of the problem. I mean, why you think that that's the? I mean, given that because you might say, well, it just depends on how you look at the hero, how you think about it, or how you approach it, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, because sometimes it's a matter of inspiration and it's an appropriate right. model for emulation, and sometimes it's this other thing. So why think that that's the problem rather than something like other things you've mentioned, like the beguiling features of charisma, right? Or an over reverence for tradition, or you see what I mean? I'm just not entirely sure why right. you think that this is the focusing on the hero is really the problem. So maybe I'm not
right.
hearing you right.
That's a really great question, Tommy. And it's what's okay. There's something. What's motivating the project. What's motivating the project is what I take to be a distortion of black democratic practice. Well, how does that distortion manifest itself? Well, it manifests itself, in my view, in a deformation of black individuality. Right? That the logics of white supremacy presuppose that we're all lumpable, that, that we can be collapsed into some singular homogeneous group whose interests can be represented. So this is really important because representation on Wolinian terms actually means that democracy is immediately captured at that moment. And so because of the legacies of white supremacy, right, the very ways in which we enter into the political process, right, is already deformed. So a robust form of black individuality is lost. And I'm not talking about Touré's adolescent self-reliance, right? It's pimpled face nonsense in my view, right? Where you just want to be yourself, and that's not what I'm putting forward, right? It's something much more robust than that. I should be a little bit more generous, shouldn't I? That was mean, but true. Mean, but true. So that's the motivation. So given that that's the motivation, what I'm interested in are what are those procedures that are part of how the freedom narrative works, like you just described, that in some ways aid in the deformation of this individuality. And one of the things that I take from Emerson, right, kind of that perfectionist stuff, right, is that exemplars are curious in their effects, right? Because the moment to which heroes are put forward as examples of what we could aspire to be, we can actually lose ourselves in relation to them, right? So part of the challenge, right, this is why Emerson has to make the move in Representative Men, that these are exemplars, but at the end of every chapter, he has to bring them back down to earth, right? They're representative of what we are capable of, right? It's not to say that we're all Goethe, right? Or we're all Ella Bakers, right? But we all have the capacity in the course of living, in the course of the choices that we make under particular conditions, in light of particular problems faced. If cultivated, right, we can generate the dispositions to actually be heroic. But at that very moment, we have to be mindful because the overarching value, right, is democratic life, right? So the hero in times of crisis emerges. But I said at that very moment, we have to begin the work of translating, of transforming, right? Because as I would say tomorrow, right, suddenly that heroic moment, that hero becomes the damn movement. And it's not by any choice of his or her own, right? But we need to find somebody, okay, you're gonna represent Wall Street and you're gonna be the hero. You can sit down, man, I'm just being silly. Right? So the motivating factor is what are those instances that deform and distort a certain kind of robust individuality that I think democracy, understood as the political, right, requires. That's really long-winded and not quite clear, but I know you're gonna come back at me. Yeah.
Last comment actually made me think a lot about applications for real life and in politics today and people who presume and aspire to be heroes. So the question I kind of have for you is, what onus does the hero bear and what onus do individuals bear in trying to strike that balance to make sure that we don't actually become excessive? And we know that some people aspire to be heroes who are just hucksters. And then there are people who are actually genuinely gifted, who are in a position to serve and be heroic, but yet they also kind of have this tendency to self-aggrandizement. How do we respond to that in your construct?
I don't know. I'm really trying to think about it, right? Because, well, I do know in this sense, right? And that is to say that I will make the argument tomorrow that what's distinctive about Ms. Baker is her emphasis on process, her emphasis on method, the very way in which you cultivate receptive practices, right? This listening, this tending to, right? So that even if one exudes heroic behavior, the very way in which that heroic behavior evidences itself over time and space is actually in the affirmation of others, right, and their capacities, right? So the moment the person who exhibits a certain kind of behavior suddenly believes that because of that it gives him or her license to do X, Y, and Z, right, that overshadows the capacities of others, then we have an occasion for an intervention, occasion for a readjustment, right? And it's this slow, laborious, tedious work that's involved that is the messiness of democratic life. And in that sense, right, because heroes are useful, they're important, right, especially in times of crises. But if the overriding value is democracy, then we have to really be mindful of how they can then, with the sincerity of their vision, generate postures that aren't requisite for or aren't right for democracy. But anyway, yeah.
Thank you, Eddie,
Sure did.
for the talk. There's a lot to chew on there, and for the comments as well. So one of the features of Emerson is he lacks a robust social analysis. Right? He works on a discursive frame that is rich and psychologically insightful and deep, but doesn't always penetrate to the whole domain of forces that are engaged in producing the situation. And hence, there's an essential kind of concern that emerges from looking at that. So in listening to this and looking at the arc, and I'm sorry I missed yesterday, but looking at what seems to be the arc here and interpolating into it, I wonder where this narrative ties in to the social analysis of the forces which are independent of the discursive frame, that are producing the limitations on individuals at the same time, right? I mean, independent of the discursive frame that you can reach via this sort of analysis.
Okay.
And so I have in mind, I mean, you referenced it in your commentary in some sense, talking about, although you referenced it through the frame of neoliberalism, which is again to discursify something which is a very material and socially imbricated set of forces that are somewhat independent of actors and even ideologies running them in certain respects, right? So I'm just curious where the interface is there. Not, I don't want to demand that you do all that in one short lecture, but I'm curious where the tie-in.
I appreciate you calling it short, though, David, because it was short. Right, remember, so you know I'm a Deweyan. So you know what's in the background here, right, is a rich and thick account of the social, right? So the title of the lecture is Pragmatic Reconstructions, which of course is, reconstruction is Dewey's procedure in terms of how critical intelligence moves us from a problematic situation faced to a more resolutely determined situation or defined situation, right? Resolved situation, as it were, right? So there's this sense in which the first lecture kind of laid out in a rather tedious way, right, the way in which critical intelligence, right, works in relation to problems faced. And then to locate the prophetic, right, as a component of the exercise of moral imagination, as a feature, to identify the prophetic with the moral imagination in the exercise of critical intelligence. And to the extent to which I'm doing that, right, I'm acknowledging the social in the background, right? Now, what I'm also trying to tease out is a perfectionist strand in Dewey that people don't tend to, right? So there's a wonderful essay or a tribute that Dewey writes of Emerson, where he basically makes Emerson Dewey himself, right? And it's really fascinating, right? It's really fascinating. So to the extent to which behind this talk is, in fact, Dewey's philosophy of democracy, well, it's not really Dewey's, it's actually my peculiar reading of Dewey, right? Through Wolin. right, that these moments become really, really crucial, right? This particular accent becomes really, really crucial, right? So it's not to downplay, right, those structural elements that you or I don't want to say non-discursive, right, because that's not right, right? But those elements that are reducible to how we talk about them, right? But I do want to say that, and I'm going to say this tomorrow with Wolin, right, that the political is not where it's located, it's how it's experienced, right? And this is Wolin's kind of riff on Foucault, right? So power is dispersed, right? And he begins to think about democracy in relation to that description, right? And it becomes a really interesting picture. So that's not quite sufficient. That's one part of the answer. The other part of the answer, really quickly, is that given what I'm saying about African American politics, that the question around robust black individuality actually is as material as you can get it in terms of its impact and effects, right? Given the claim I'm making, if that makes sense, right?
Final word?
Final word, thanks, Skip. Excellent presentation.
Thank you, sir.
I think, Skip, we should send his name in to substitute for Peter Gomes. Two quickies. The step from heroism,
Yes, sir.
and I'm thinking of Strauss's Heldenleben and so forth, to martyrdom. You omitted the most important step, which is death. Now, Kennedys, the two Kennedys, Martin Luther King, death. Napoleon, Noriega, diminution of their powers. So my thought is that in continuation of your excellent chosen themes of Malcolm X as a hero, think of the importance of his death, making him a hero. And nephew, there are some of us here in Roxbury, not Morris Point, that saw red around Roxbury. And the creation of him being a hero was his moments of epiphany in Child Street Jail, 2 miles from here. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. I'm thinking of just trying to call up that line in Baldwin's The Fire Next Time about death, where death, the reality of death leads one to embrace with passion the conundrum of life, right? But what if, in fact, death doesn't lead one to embrace with passion the conundrum of life, but actually, because death produces the ghosts that haunt, one winds up cowering. Thank you.